This project, I think, very much fits into a theme that's been running through my work for quite a few years. I think it's possibly been triggered by an exhibition that I had at the instigation of Francis Kyle, which is the gallery that I show with. It was entitled The Saxon Shore, and that introduced me to the idea of the sort of Anglo-Saxons and their impact on landscape, and I was so captivated actually with that notion that I actually moved from Brighton, where I was living at the time, to live in East Anglia, and that then changed the kind of subject matter of what I was doing. And I was moving back, I think, towards the interests that I'd had when I was much younger, and also the interests that have now subsequently sort of fueled my work and have become a main part of my work. The change from watercolour to oil really coincided with a change in subject matter. Originally with the watercolour I was concerned with subjects that were more figurative, urban subjects, and it coincided with a period where I was doing stuff that was based more on road trips really. I'd travel down the Mississippi River as a kind of personal pilgrimage, I guess, to go to places that had always interested me to do with my interest in music. Painting in oils allowed me to open up the subject matter to British landscape subjects where I could explore new textures and paint things on a different scale really. I prefer to work on board rather than canvas because it allows me to kind of indulge my interest in the sort of glassy surfaces of water and the fine detail of light that you get when you're looking into the sun. For me, when you're painting on canvas, the canvas sometimes kind of interrupts that. It introduces another texture into the mix, which, personally speaking, I don't want. Painting landscapes is done in the studio. It's a kind of act of reflection, really. I think if I was out in the field with an easel, painting directly, they would be painted much more vigorously. And I would be much more open to suggestion of what was happening at the time. Whereas if I take my material and my thoughts back into the studio, I can then think about what it is that I want to say about the place on the basis of the number of times that I've been there. Because often these paintings are distillations of a number of visits at different times of day. And so the studio offers a kind of contemplative space, a quiet space, where I can reflect on what I've done.
These pilgrimages that you've been making for your art, you're making journeys which are really, in a sense, it's as much about the actual journey as the destination and the physical process of walking and what that does to you and your sense of well-being, both physically and spiritually. I just wondered if you could tell me a bit about what walking means to you.
If you walk for quite long distances, you do enter a kind of meditative state. Your passage through a place transforms your thoughts, your mind thinks about other things.
And certainly from my experience, walking alone is a completely different activity and a much more fulfilling one. But it's a mental exercise as well as a physical, and the two converge in a very fascinating way.
The kind of walking that I do for my work is solitary walking, and by its very nature it is much more, you're much more alone with yourself, much more alone with your thoughts, and you're much more alone with the rhythm of your own body. A long distance walk is something that everyone gets some kind of spiritual feeling from. It may not be a religious one, it may not have a religious end, but the very act of walking and taking yourself through the land is one through which you will transform your own sense of well-being. You'll come back feeling both replenished and also fatigued. Walking is absolutely core to what I do, really. It's the way that I interact with the landscape. It's a way of working out what the place is about and the angles of sight that there are on a place, and where the sun's rising and where the sun's setting, which are all features of what I do. So walking and painting for me go hand in hand, and my interest in landscape really came from my passion from walking, really. I think what I'm trying to do when I paint a landscape is to create an image which has a significant confluence of events. So it's not just about the place, it's about a particular moment in the place. So it's almost a fleeting transitional point. It's there, it's gone. So it's when the light is in a particular section of the sky, the clouds are doing a particular thing, the tide's up, the tide's down, or if it's sunrise and sunset. These are all very fleeting instants. And although the landscape is a kind of passive element in it, it kind of accepts, it becomes the medium for sort of transferring that idea to the viewer. The idea of a low light is very seductive, because I think what it does is it blurs the distinction between land and sky, and it creates an atmosphere that can almost transform a place. It's amazing how being in a place and walking around it for hours, being there at the point when the sun sets, it all of a sudden becomes something very different. It reveals an aspect of its character that I'd never seen before. And I think also with my interest in landscape history, seeing a place at low light often reveals features like old plough marks or old field boundaries or barrows that just were hidden from the eye until that moment when the light comes down and it just catches them, it glances them and it lights them up. And all of a sudden there's this feeling that an older landscape has been revealed to you. I think anybody who paints British landscape has to engage with British weather. And British weather is notoriously difficult to predict. Weather is a very important part of what I do, and often when I paint, the first thing that I paint is the sky, because in a way the sky dictates the whole atmosphere, the whole sort of character of the painting. Because the wonderful thing about painting cloudy skies is it allows this kind of selective illumination of the landscape, where one area can suddenly be lit up by this amazing light and another place can be plunged into a kind of darkness that is very dramatic. And that for me is an important part of what I'm doing, is the weather is a kind of way of commenting in a way on the subject of the painting. The way that I came at this project, which is done in response to the Lindisfarne Gospels returning to the northeast, was to look at the life of St Cuthbert. It has to be remembered that St Cuthbert was the person to whom the Lindisfarne Gospels were partly dedicated, and the Gospels were produced on Lindisfarne by a bishop who was working within lifetime memory of Cuthbert. And St Cuthbert is the figure that most encompasses the spiritual life of the Kingdom of Northumbria. He's a central figure, really. St Cuthbert was born in 634, somewhere in the area that is now southern Scotland, though obviously was Northumbria at the time, and he became a monk at Melrose, and then led large amounts of his life as a hermit, largely staying on in a farm. About 11 years he lived as a hermit. I think he was reluctant actually to become a bishop, but it was insisted by the king at the time he should do so, and he was bishop for 2 years, and then he retired back to Innerfarn, where he died. The painting of the snow on the Lammermuir Hills is evocative of the moment when St Cuthbert, who working as a shepherd, had a revelation at the very moment when St Aidan died on Lindisfarne, and it was that point when he then turned towards religion and God and admitted himself to the abbey at Melrose, which wasn't far. Of course, St Aidan, who is a slightly overlooked character in the story, was a very important character because he was the one that had been invited by King Oswald of Northumbria to bring Christianity to his people. And it was he who established the church and the monastic community on Lindisfarne. There are two journeys that are at the core of this project. One is the journey of Cuthbert when he was alive, and these are the places that were important points in his life journey where events happened that were part of St Cuthbert's story. And the second is a journey that was made after his death by the monks of Lindisfarne, carrying his body and his relics from Lindisfarne to eventually come to rest in Durham. And that's a story that took place over a period of about 107 years, something like that. The reason why we remember Cuthbert today is because the monks were very careful to preserve the memory of Cuthbert and his relics, and Durham itself owes its existence to those relics and to the monks that settled there. Whithorn, which is in the southwest of Scotland, in Galloway, was during the time of Bede very firmly within the sphere of Northumbria. It had a Northumbrian abbot. but it was also famed as a pilgrimage route in its own right. But what's interesting from the story of St Cuthbert is after his death, his relics were taken on this 7-year journey, and at one point the Gospels were washed out into the sea because it was thought that St Cuthbert's body didn't want to be taken from the British Isles, and a big storm had come up and cast the Gospels into the sea as a punishment to the party involved. But in a revelation, one of the monks was told to go round to Whithorn, and there miraculously the tide went out, and resting out where the sea had been were the Gospels unharmed. The story of the flight from Lindisfarne not only involves the Lindisfarne Gospels, which are well known, but it also involves the Gospel of St John, known as St Cuthbert's Gospel, which this year, 2013, was purchased by the British Library. It's an astonishing relic, really. It's an original Anglo-Saxon copy of the Gospels in its binding, making it, I think, the oldest book of its kind in Europe. Obviously, this was carried around in the coffin by the monks on their 7-year journey through the Kingdom of Northumbria.
I mean, I know you've read and researched a lot about the ancient history of these places, and I just wonder, I mean, do you think the pilgrims would come and sort of set up camp along the coast? And
yeah, I think there would have been a kind of industry associated with pilgrimage, not so much during the time of Cuthbert, which is pre the conquest, but certainly in the early Middle Ages, pilgrimage was big business, and there were a lot of people associated with it. And I have come across this statistic. I don't know how true it is, but at any one time in Europe, there were 25% of the population were either involved in pilgrimage, so they were on pilgrimage, or they were supplying pilgrims with food, hospitality, beds, or supplying the churches with artifacts for sale and all the rest of it. So
it was really the equivalent of the modern tourist
Absolutely.
industry.
This is something that was a big business, and even if you go to Canterbury today and you know there's buildings that still existing within the city that are the almshouses, the hospitals that were there to cater for pilgrims, and you know this would have been the same here in medieval times, because of course there was a big monastery out on Lindisfarne that you know, there would have been numbers of people, and they'd have been arriving by sea, they would have been arriving by land across the causeway, and they'd have all been converging across this landscape to get to this point, to make this crossing over to this island. And I think that is what is so special about this place. And Lindisfarne is still so important, is it because it connects us still with events that took place here back in the 7th century and still resonate today in the foundation of Durham and the return of the Lindisfarne Gospels to Durham and Durham's sense of its own identity.
Northumbria gets its name from the lands north of the Humber, and this would have been the border. This is the north bank of the Humber estuary. The sheer size of the Kingdom of Northumbria really took me by surprise, because like everyone, I think you are familiar with the idea of Northumberland, which is this small, modern representation of the kingdom. But to see that it went all the way up to the Firth of Forth and beyond Edinburgh, and right the way to the coast of Ayrshire in Scotland, and then right the way down to Lincoln and Cheshire and even Anglesey and the Isle of Man, was something that I'd never dreamt of, to be honest. And I am Scottish myself. I've grown up in England, but I grew up on the Ayrshire coast, which was possibly part of Northumbria. No one can be perfectly sure where it began and ended. I then grew up in Lancashire, which again was part of Northumbria, and I'm now painting subjects about Northumbrian saints that are being shown in Northumberland. It kind of gives a context to my life that I didn't before have. And it's quite interesting, I think, if you reflect on the modern ideas of national identity that are very current at the moment with the devolution question in Scotland, about Scotland and England. The fact that actually, long before there was Scotland and long before there was England, there was this other place which was Northumbria, which encompassed both of them. And actually, if you think about it, Scotland has a language which it owes to Northumbria. And so that it's still very current and part of its history, but it seems to have been lost. And it's sad, because The Lindisfarne Gospels are as much an artefact that comes from the Scottish history and the spiritual history of Iona as it comes from the history of England and Durham, where they ended up. The painting of Tyningham is interesting because we are now no longer in the realms of Northumberland. This is an image of the Kingdom of Northumbria. It's actually modern day Scotland, but you're walking along a beach near Tyningham and you're looking towards the Bass Rock, where the Northumbrian saint, St Baldred, had a hermitage, and he's buried nearby. So you're very much within the realm of Northumbrian spirituality. Bass Rock itself is an intriguing spot. It's the plug of an old volcano. It just rises sheer cliffs out of the Firth of Forth, and of course now is a modern bird refuge and is still as difficult to get to today as it was in St Baldred's time. I think it's always been important for me to gravitate back towards the coast, because that's where my prime interest is, I think, as a painter. I think also with Lindisfarne it's important maybe to see it, like Iona is, as an island. It's a place which you have to cross water to get to, and I think that crossing of water, going over another element, is an important aspect of these places. And I think it was an important draw to the early hermits and the early Christians that lived in these places. And I think that's still part of the magic of these places today. And although people maybe aren't self-conscious about that act, I think there is a kind of excitement when people come to a place that the tide may cut them off.
Ramsay, I know that you had an exhibition a few years ago which was themed on the whole subject of pilgrimages, and that you've done walks all over the country to different places and islands and destinations, but I seem to feel from what you've said that Lindisfarne is the place that really is dearest to your heart and which inspires you most, and to which you come back and back. And I wondered if you could tell me a bit about what it is that makes Lindisfarne so special to you.
It was a day a little bit like this. It was overcast, and I was going to take this walk that we're doing now, which is across the Holy Island Sands, following the staves that take you directly to the island. And for the first time I saw footprints, and they weren't just the footfall of normal walkers. These were barefoot footprints in the mud, the same footprints that we're making now. And it struck me that here was a place that not only was still functioning as a place of pilgrimage, but also that by taking off your shoes, you as a pilgrim were connecting to a much greater tradition, a more profound interaction with the place, something that had been going on for, well, at least 1300 years really in the case of here. And to have that connection with a place is really exceptionally unusual. And it not only is this a very beautiful place, a very unusual place from, in many ways, just purely because it is a tidal island and because of its wildlife and ecology, the weather around it, the light, but also it has this other layer of meaning, this other way that people connect with it. And that just set me off on a journey. Those footprints that I saw in the sands were the first footprints in the journeys that I took following the footfall of pilgrims present and past.
One of the very interesting aspects about the sands at Lindisfarne is how changeable they are, and how from season to season the nature of the sand is totally transformed. This image shows the sands late winter, early spring, where they've been scoured by the winter storms, and the sand has taken on the pattern of the waves above it. But at other times of year, the sands can be completely flat. What I also like about the sands are the posts that seem to describe the journey across to Lindisfarne. These are very evocative. They kind of describe the space, and having a cloud just cut across one of the staves just gives a little gentle reminder of perhaps of the Christian history of Lindisfarne. Water is a theme that is strongly represented in these paintings. And it's a theme that I keep coming back to in my own work. I think there's something fascinating about trying to paint water. It's something that you can never tire of. It's a sort of volatile element. It's always on the move. It's restless. It's transparent. It's reflective. It's dark. It's light. It takes on the colours around it. It's something that no matter how much I paint it, I can never tire of tackling.